Welcome to New Thinking for a New World, a Tallberg Foundation podcast. I am Alan Stoga, your host. Each week, I bring you conversations with people who think differently about the great issues that are shaping our world. Geopolitics, disruptive tech, mass migration, the changing climate, culture wars, all of it is grist for our mill. I hope you enjoy listening. I also hope you will let me know what you think and that you join the conversation at tallbergfoundation.org. And now for today's episode of New Thinking for a New World. Recently, Sweden's security service raised its assessment of the level of terrorism threat against the country to 4 on a scale of 1 to 5. Sweden is now regarded as a priority target by extremist Islamic groups. Indeed, the Prime Minister recently said that several attacks have already been thwarted. The cause, or maybe the excuse, is a series of Koran burnings by anti-Islamic activists earlier this summer that outraged Muslims around the world. Although the Swedish government condemned the burnings, they couldn't stop them because of freedom of speech protections in Swedish law. The irony, of course, is that Sweden, one of the most liberal democracies in the world, is now caught in a double bind. To prevent more public Quran desecrations, which it badly wants to do, it's becoming significantly less liberal. That circumstance and that challenge applies well beyond Sweden, I think, which is why today's guest, Elisabeth Braw, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a columnist for both Foreign Policy and Politico Europe, is important to talk to. She recently published an article on the Swedish dilemma, How Tolerance Makes Nations Vulnerable. Welcome, Elisabeth, to New Thinking for a New World.
Thank you.
In your Financial Times article, you reminded readers of Karl Popper's Open Society and Its Enemies, which he started writing in 1938. Why are his arguments about tolerance, which were formulated in the context of the challenges of Nazi Germany, relevant today?
Yeah, it's extraordinary that the book written decades ago about a societal phenomenon that applied then can apply so strongly today in liberal democracies. And this is really a problem for liberal democracies because the way we are set up, which is what he also outlines, is that we are societies of tolerance. And there is a social contract there, which is that everybody puts tolerance into the mix and gets tolerance back. And that has worked pretty well for us. Obviously, we need legislation. We need that framework of the rule of law and of punishment if you break the rule of law. But in terms of the interaction among citizens, including discourse, that we have left pretty free because we have been able to count on citizens prizing liberal democracy so much that they will be tolerant vis-a-vis others because they want others to be tolerant vis-a-vis them. And where this really hits a barrier is when some parts of society, some individuals exploit that tolerance and that extreme or that fantastic, wonderful, amazing freedom that we give our citizens, when they exploit that to harm the very society that gives them that freedom and that gives them that freedom to voice opinions. And that's where we are today.
Of course, there's an argument that it is that extremism that somehow strengthens democracy, that it causes people to react and reinforce the basic freedoms. And clearly that is the double bind. How much extremism can you tolerate in a tolerant society? At what point do you have to become intolerant of extremism?
Yes, at what point do you have to become intolerant? And the way we have operated so far is we've been trying to plead with people to use our better selves, to consider others, to be considerate of others. And we have only really legislated against and then prosecuted violent crimes. So, for example, if you attack somebody clearly, in the name of ideology, you are still prosecuted for it. But if you criticize that person, you don't go to jail because we have freedom of speech. But you can. What we're seeing today is that you can do so much harm, maybe not physical harm to people, but you can do harm to society at large by exploiting that freedom. And so that means that the rest of society, which is, I argue, it's still the majority, the rest of society then has to think about what do we do about this if pleading goes nowhere, if there are elements of society that are willing to engage in very provocative acts and indeed trigger violence elsewhere through their words and through their actions, even if they don't physically attack anybody, then we have to start entertaining that notion that maybe we should be less tolerant of radical views simply because a liberal democracy is not guaranteed to exist. It's a construct that we all have to be part of keeping up and maintaining. And if a large enough chunk of the population attacks that construct, it's not going to be able to withstand those attacks. It's going to crumble.
Popper also argued a sort of theory of history as a long-term battle between proponents of open society and proponents of closed society. And that's, of course, back where we are again in terms of world order, competition between open and closed, democracies and autocracies. As you point out, it is stunning that we've gone full circle. We're almost back to 1938 when he's beginning to think about exactly that challenge, open versus closed. So much for the end of history.
So much for the end of history, indeed. And I think even those who strongly believe that history had taken a new turn after the end of the Cold War, even they have been disabused of that notion. And I think most of us have realized by this point that the history goes in circles, and we see dark turns, and then people after a while after having been part of such a dark turn for a while, they realize that no, this is absolutely not a desirable way to live, and they try to establish something resembling democracy, which is obviously what has happened at many points. And we had a nice and long run with liberal democracy in Western Europe and North America and a few other places during the 20th century, and we still do. And in other places, it's more recent. And I just sincerely hope that we won't have to take that dark turn before we realize how valuable and how precious liberal democracy is. And I think, Alan, this is a really crucial point. Most of us don't take we take liberal democracy for granted. Those of us living in liberal democracies, those of us who have never experienced any other form of society, we take liberal democracy for granted. We just assume they will always be around because that's the only way of life we know. But there is nothing guaranteed about liberal democracy. It requires everybody to put in a certain amount of effort, even a small amount of effort, but everybody has to pitch in to help maintain it, because otherwise it will collapse under the pressure and burden and attacks of those who hate liberal democracy.
Let's turn to Sweden, which is the specific case that you discussed in your article. In resume, what happened?
What happened was, Alan, it's an extraordinary turn of events. So Sweden applied for NATO membership last year. And it had assurances, informal assurances from Turkey that, and indeed from every other NATO member state that it would get the green light for NATO membership when it applied. So it applied. Then after it applied, President Erdogan said, well, we have these concerns about Kurdish militants that have been given asylum in Sweden. We want Sweden to extradite them. So there were negotiations between Sweden and Turkey, and they've reached some sort of agreement that Sweden would monitor Kurdish extremism more closely in Sweden. And of course, Sweden does monitor extremist activities that violate the law. So Sweden promised Turkey essentially to keep a close eye to make sure that there was no illegal activity. But Turkey kept up the pressure and indeed unfairly changed its demands after Sweden had already agreed to one set of demands. So that kept going. Then some troublemakers realized that this was the perfect opportunity to get attention for various reasons. So there is a Danish provocateur, a career provocateur called Rasmus Paludan, who stages stunts, far-right stunts every now and then. So he thought, oh, this is a good time to travel to Stockholm and desecrate the Koran to anger President Erdogan, because look how much attention I will get if I anger President Erdogan. And that's what he did. Then some anti-NATO activists, a tiny group, thought, oh, this is a good idea. We're going to hang an effigy of President Erdogan in Stockholm to anger President Erdogan, to make sure that he permanently blocks Swedish access to NATO, because we don't want Sweden to join NATO. So that is the background. And that was at the beginning of the year. Then in June of this year, a mysterious man, an Iraqi refugee, burnt a Koran in Stockholm. And this is what set in motion this extraordinary anger campaign that Sweden has been experiencing since then, and which has led to the state that Sweden is in now, with a heightened terror alert or terror risk alert. And the more is known about this man, the Iraqi refugee, the more peculiar, strange, odd the case becomes. So he is not just any refugee. He said that he wanted to burn a Quran to protest against Islam, but I think there are other ways of protesting against Islam. Not just I think, there are other ways. But he did that, but he's not just any refugee. He's somebody who has led a militia in Iraq, and the militia linked to Iran. So he's clearly he has a certain background, and he left that position after a power struggle with another militia leader. So there we are. And that triggered an instantaneous disinformation campaign against Sweden. And that's what I think is something that other countries really should look at, to make sure that they are better prepared for similar campaigns against them. So a massive disinformation campaign against Sweden is propagated primarily by Arabic language accounts and Russian language accounts on social media. And then the governments of Iran, Iraq, and a few other countries pushing for the Organization of Islamic States to condemn Sweden for Islamophobia, which is where we are today. Massive Muslim anger against Sweden on incorrect grounds, because what they are alleging is that the Swedish government supports Quran burnings, and anybody who knows about Swedish administrative law knows that this is a matter for local police agencies, and they don't have the right to ban anything. They can issue protest permits, or they cannot issue protest permits, but they can't say you may protest, but you may not burn a Quran. So that's where we are today.
Thanks for listening so far. I hope you're enjoying the conversation as much as I have. If you haven't already, please subscribe on the platform of your choice and rate us on Apple Podcast. Now back to today's discussion, sponsored by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, SNF. You've just described the double bind. On the one hand, Swedish authorities and the prime minister has repeatedly said, I don't want any holy books to be burned. I think it's a bad thing that people burn holy books, whether it's the Koran or the Bible or the Torah. This shouldn't happen. But the only way I can stop it would be, in fact, by dramatically changing how Sweden thinks and acts about protest, about freedom of speech. Indeed, there are some people in Sweden who seem to be trying to find a solution, a legal solution, to change the law, to make this illegal, to somehow pull into government authority, the ability to stop these things before they happen. I'm sure everyone is thinking about the Charlie Hebdo massacre in 2015 as a truly ugly precedent. What did the Swedes do?
What do they do? Well, the problem, Alan, is that if they change the legislation now, it will signal to the world that if you attack verbally and otherwise, because we should remember that in Iraq, a mob attacked the Swedish embassy and the Iraqi government expelled the ambassador instead of apologizing for a mob being able to attack and indeed enter the embassy. So what happens now, if Sweden does change the legislation, is that it sends a message to the world that if you attack verbally and perhaps physically a liberal democracy, strongly enough, that liberal democracy will say, "Oh, this is uncomfortable. We better compromise so that it doesn't happen again." And so, of course, if you send that message as a liberal democracy, the side that is willing to engage in verbal and other aggression against you will do even more of it. It's not going to say, well, I'm glad you agreed to this compromise. Now we'll live happily ever after because you agreed to this one thing. And this is the challenge, Alan, of being a liberal democracy. Because you, as a liberal democracy, are mostly tolerant. And so you assume that others will be tolerant too. But in the end, you may be the only side that is tolerant. So you make concessions, whereas the other side doesn't make concessions. Whereas the other side, whether the other side is extremists and subversive elements in your own country or indeed foreign governments.
We referenced end of history. We should reference clash of civilizations. This is a clash of civilizations that in some ways seems to me irreconcilable. And it isn't just clearly, as you said, some of the protest in the Arab world is politically motivated. All those Russian trolls probably don't care much about the Koran, but they certainly do care about NATO membership. But there's also a fair amount of, you and I would both argue, uninformed popular reaction. This is the famed Arab street reacting, it's a bad thing, etc. That circle I can't imagine how to square that circle.
Well, I don't think it's a clash between people of different faiths, whether in Sweden or elsewhere. I think it's a clash between those wanting to live in a tolerant way and those who, for whatever reason, are keen to exploit that and harm the other side. And I think in the case of the governments of Iran and Iraq and indeed Russia, they are keen to deflect attention from their own failings and move move the discourse and the focus of global discourse onto another country, which they have managed to do brilliantly. If you look at what people are talking about today, just like you and I are talking about the case of Sweden, instead of talking about the women's protests in Iran, that is the case in many other places. Iran has the Iranian government has a massive domestic problem at its hands because women are standing up for the right not to wear a headscarf. And so Iran, in this case, has a reason to try to deflect attention from that and from its failing, really, its failure to listen to its own population. So I think it's a clash between tolerant societies and tolerant members of society and people, individuals and governments that are, for whatever reason, on a warpath against that way of life and are willing to exploit the freedom that liberal democracy grants to harm that very liberal democracy.
In contrast to a place like Iran, as you mentioned, or Afghanistan, where clearly we in the West are outraged by policies vis-a-vis women, vis-a-vis children, and so on. But those governments clearly don't care. There's not an equivalence of care. We feel guilty about Koran burnings in Sweden. They clearly don't feel guilty about, in Afghanistan, not allowing girls to go to school.
we should remember that Koran burnings in Sweden, we're saying it in plural, but it really is a rare phenomenon. It was a rare phenomenon until this Iraqi refugee, who knows what his motivations are, who knows whether he has mental health issues, whether he has links to groups and regimes wishing Sweden ill. But it was manageable. It was very rare until he came along. And then suddenly the floodgates of disinformation broke open. And if I may add, Alan, we all have responsibility to make sure that the information we share, especially on social media, but also elsewhere, that it is accurate. Because part of the reason that this anger campaign against Sweden grew so quickly is that people were careless in the information they were sharing. And there was not just the disinformation from those Arabic and Russian accounts, language accounts, but there was also sloppiness in reporting by international correspondents who may not be familiar with Swedish administrative law. So they wrongly assume that it's the government that grants permissions for protests and that the government can say whether you may or may not burn a Koran. That is obviously not the case. And so all this information and resulting anger was spread by lots of people, including people who unwittingly shared incorrect information simply because they didn't verify before sharing.
Well, that's an incredibly important point and is part of the wallpaper of the 21st century. You're right. We, air quotes on the word we, ought to be more responsible and think twice before we push that send button. But nobody does, or very few people do. And it is not controllable. It is not regulatable. And it is only getting worse, not just globally, but domestically. And I do want to switch focal points. You're sitting in Washington, so it's legitimate to ask about American politics, which have obviously become hyper-partisan. The two tribes no longer just disagree. They're starting to threaten each other in some really even violent ways. Both are increasingly intolerant of the other. Some of my progressive friends would argue that Trump should not be tolerated. And some of my radical conservative friends say the same of Biden or of AOC and the progressive left. If we put all that inside the Popper frame, how do you think about preventing the United States from really going down some pretty dark paths as this tolerance of intolerance continues? Should we tolerate hate speech, tolerate extreme political speech?
It is extraordinary, Alan. I've lived in America on and off since 1996, and even in that time frame, which isn't very long in the scheme of things, I've seen American society go from mostly friendly and people willing to engage and have chats with people of all political persuasions to this, as you say, hyper-partisan environment. And we can say it's fueled by social media. Yes, it is fueled by social media, but what do we do about it? Well, I think this downward spiral started with something that Robert Putnam, who is a sociologist, that he documented in a fantastic book that came out in 1999 called Bowling Alone. And I remember reading it then and being blown away by what he documented. And for those of your listeners who may not have read it, what he documented was a decline in civic participation in America. And it was stark. So people belonged to far fewer clubs and associations in 1999 than they had done in the 1950s. They had meals together far less often than they had in the 1950s, and so on and so on. And back in 1999, when the book came out, it was an interesting set of facts that Robert Putnam presented. And it's similar. The development is similar in other Western countries, even though maybe less stark than in America. But what it documented was interesting in its own right and frightening. But what we have seen since then is that people, because they don't interact with their fellow citizens on a regular basis, including fellow citizens who may be different from them, have different political views, different age, and so forth, they are much more willing to think ill of their fellow citizens. And of course, they don't spend their time that they in the past spent in, bowling clubs or educational associations or what have you, or indeed choirs. They don't spend that time reading Karl Popper. They spend that time on social media mostly, unfortunately, which leads down this narrow tunnel of only reading and seeing information that you already agree with. And in the most extreme of cases, it leads to involvement in conspiracy theories, which was obviously what triggered the January 6th attack on the Capitol. So that's where we are today. And I think, Alan, as a result, what we need is, and this may be difficult to do, but we need new societal institutions that people can participate in. It used to be churches or denominations, bowling clubs. I've sung in choirs all my life. The choirs are fortunately still vibrant, but maybe we need new places where people can gather so that they engage with their fellow human beings on a regular basis, including those who are different, hold different views. As I said, people of different ages. And the more you interact with others, the less inclined you become to feel anger and resentment and hatred of them. And as I said, this may be difficult to do because what are the new societal institutions we need? That I think would be a subject for another podcast episode. But I think the more we interact with one another, the less angry we become, and the more willing we become to think well of our fellow human beings and of society.
Not to beat a dead horse, everything you just said is even more true after the pandemic and in the context of work from home. Both of those led to less social interaction, less open conversation, and more living on a screen or living through a screen rather than sort of normal, what you and I would call would be normal social interaction. Last question. The last sentence of your article is this: liberal democracies should learn from Popper that supporting tolerance means treating the intolerant with intolerance. I think it's a terrific punchline. I've asked this once, I'll ask it slightly differently. At what point does it risk becoming self-defeating? That is, of closing down what we both want, which is the most open society possible?
Is such a difficult measurement to make. What is acceptable expressions of free speech that are maybe unpalatable, but should still be tolerated? I think the moment you have free speech you have expressions of free speech that incite violence against your own country, I think that's where you have to draw the line. We can have any manner of ugly opinions, what most people might consider ugly opinions. We can still allow those to exist within our societies and be expressed within our societies. But if we draw the line at opinions that incite violence, I think that may be maybe not the perfect, but the best possible red line to draw for what we can permit within our societies while remaining tolerant.
Thank you, Elisabeth Braw, for that, both that summary and this conversation. Again, I urge everyone to read How Tolerance Makes Nations Vulnerable. Somewhere on the page that you're looking at, you can click on that link. Thank you, Elisabeth. And we'll have this conversation again. I suspect these issues aren't going away. I suspect they're going to get far worse.
That is unfortunately the case. So I look forward to chatting with you again.
Thank you for listening to this episode of New Thinking for a New World. I'm Alan Stoga, podcast host, and I look forward to your joining our next conversation. Remember, tell us what you think at tallbergfoundation.org.